The grand chamber of the Galactic Council buzzed with quiet arrogance. At its heart, the Zelther delegation leaned forward, their six-eyed gaze fixed on the human representative, Captain Elias Voss. "Humans fear war," the Zelther diplomat intoned, his voice like grinding stone, "a species that speaks of peace, but in their hearts knows they cannot stomach the true cost of battle." A ripple of agreement swept through the room. The members, representatives of the galaxy's most powerful civilizations, nodded in solemn affirmation. High Chancellor Drexel, a towering figure with crystalline blue skin, raised a webbed hand. His voice, rich with authority, echoed in the chamber. "The human race is untested. Their military is little more than a handful of ships and primitive weapons. They lack the resolve to wage true war." Voss stood rigidly, fighting to suppress the flush of frustration rising in his chest. He had always been a negotiator, someone who believed in diplomacy and dialogue. But today, these accusations, these miscalculations, stung deeply. He opened his mouth to speak, but the Chancellor cut him off, a low rumble vibrating from his throat. "Let us not waste time," Drexel said. "The Zorvith have struck first. They have laid waste to the neutral colony on Gaia 9, and we have already seen the tragic consequences of such barbarism." His gaze flicked briefly to Voss. "Humans will crumble under the weight of true warfare." The Council's laughter was polite but dismissive. Every species in that room had witnessed conflict, borne the weight of centuries of war. Yet none had ever believed humans could survive on their terms. They were fragile, soft, too prone to emotion. They might fight back in a skirmish, but in the grand game of galactic dominance, they were unworthy opponents. Voss clenched his jaw, his voice steady, though the fire in his eyes was unmistakable. "You misunderstand," he said, meeting the eyes of each council member. "Humans do not fear war. We understand its cost. But we also understand what it means to fight for survival." His words were sharp, cutting through the complacency that filled the chamber like a dense fog. He turned to face Drexel, his eyes narrowing. "You underestimate us. You will see soon enough what happens when humans are pushed to the edge." The Zelther sneered, and Drexel's face remained impassive. The debate raged on, with various factions calling for passive measures, peaceful resolutions, and calculated avoidance of escalation. All the while, the situation on Gaia 9 worsened. Voss knew the truth none of the Council seemed willing to accept: humans had already chosen their path. He had already received the order from Earth Command, an order that would shake the galaxy to its core. The Zorvith, a ruthless empire known for its bloodthirsty conquests, had attacked the humans. And they would soon regret it. The scene shifted as Voss arrived at New Terra, a human colony barely 20 hours from its utter destruction. The Zorvith had already begun their assault, sending shockwaves through the defense lines, tearing through cities and towns with brutal efficiency. Voss stepped off the shuttle onto the cracked surface of the colony, his boots grinding against the ashen soil. The acrid scent of smoke and burned metal filled the air. Fires still raged in the distance, and the distant cries of survivors echoed in the silence. It was a grim sight, one that filled Voss with a cold fury. He approached the colony's command center, where survivors had gathered to formulate a plan. His eyes swept over the weary, bloodied faces of the soldiers, their equipment haphazardly arranged around them. Their commander, a young woman named General Sienna Hayes, stood at the center, her gaze locked on a screen that flickered with data. "General," Voss said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "I've been ordered to bring you back to Earth for peace talks." She glanced up at him, her expression unreadable. "Peace talks," she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "With who, Voss? The Zorvith?" Voss stared at her. "We have no choice. The Council believes it's the only option." Her eyes hardened, but she didn't speak. "The Zorvith won't listen," Voss continued. "We're alone in this. We have to fight back." He stepped closer, his voice low but resolute. "You know what they've done here. We can't afford to be merciful anymore. We're not just defending our colonies, we're defending our future." A silence fell over the room. The hum of machinery, the soft beeping of equipment, was the only sound as Hayes regarded him, weighing his words. Finally, she nodded. "You're right," she said, the steel in her voice unmistakable. "The council is wrong. We will fight back." Voss turned away, his mind already racing ahead. He had always believed that diplomacy could solve the galaxy's problems. But now, as the flames of war spread across the stars, he knew that only the strength of humanity's resolve would decide their fate. And for the first time, Voss realized that the Council's greatest mistake wasn't underestimating humanity, it was believing that humanity would hesitate when faced with the ultimate test. The Zorvith battleship loomed above New Terra like a malevolent shadow, its jagged edges cutting through the atmosphere. The planet's once thriving cities were now craters, their inhabitants scrambling for shelter beneath the battered remnants of their own homes. To the Zorvith, it was just another conquest, another victory to add to their blood-soaked history. But to Captain Elias Voss, it was something far more personal. Voss stood at the edge of a ruined city, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the massive warship hung ominously in the sky. The hum of the command center behind him was a quiet contrast to the chaos unfolding outside. General Sienna Hayes, her face streaked with dirt and determination, approached him, her boots crunching against the ash-laden ground. "We're out of time," she said, her voice sharp. "The Zorvith are coordinating their final assault. If we don't do something soon, we'll lose everything." Voss nodded grimly. "We don't have the luxury of waiting for the Council's approval. They're not coming." Hayes clenched her fists, a fire burning in her eyes. "Then it's up to us. We'll show the Zorvith that humans don't bow to anyone." A tense silence hung between them as Voss surveyed the war-torn landscape. The weight of their decision hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about survival, it was about sending a message to the galaxy. Humanity was not weak, not fragile, and certainly not afraid of war. "Call the resistance," Voss said, his voice low but firm. "It's time to turn the tide." Hours later, the resistance had gathered in what remained of the central command hub. A ragtag group of soldiers, civilians, and engineers huddled around makeshift holographic displays, their faces etched with exhaustion but determined. Voss stepped into the room, his eyes sweeping over the group. He could see the fear in their eyes, but also something else, resolve. He tapped the table, drawing everyone's attention. "The Zorvith think we're weak," he began, his voice steady but filled with the fire of a man who had nothing left to lose. "They think we'll fold under their assault, just like every other species they've conquered. But we're not like the others. We will fight back." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Hayes, standing beside him, nodded. "We've got one shot at this. The Zorvith expect us to cower, but we've been preparing for this moment. We have weapons they've never seen, tactics they can't comprehend." Voss's gaze hardened. "They think we're just another victim. Let's prove them wrong." He turned to the display, outlining their strategy. The Zorvith fleet, massive and seemingly unstoppable, had underestimated the human capacity for innovation. For years, Earth's engineers had worked in secret, developing advanced weaponry and defense systems designed for one purpose: survival against an overwhelming enemy. The Zorvith relied on sheer force, brute strength, and intimidation. But humanity's greatest weapon wasn't its firepower, it was its adaptability. As Voss spoke, the resistance members began assembling their forces. Soldiers armed with newly forged rifles, engineers working on setting up makeshift defense turrets, and civilians rushing to prepare safe zones for the vulnerable. There was a rawness to the operation, a sense of urgency that cut through the air like a blade. "We'll use the city's ruins to our advantage," Voss continued. "The Zorvith expect an open fight, let's give them something else. Guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run strategies. They'll never see us coming." Hayes added, her voice sharp, "And don't forget the drones. We've got a fleet of them ready to launch. They'll provide us with recon and hit them where it hurts most." The holographic map shifted, showing the Zorvith positions above New Terra. Voss's finger traced the areas where their enemies had concentrated their forces. "They'll be expecting a full-on assault. That's when we hit them. We'll force them into a position where they have no choice but to engage on our terms. The next hours blurred into a whirlwind of preparation. The resistance moved swiftly, utilizing every scrap of humanity's ingenuity to set up a defense unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Voss and Hayes worked side by side, their minds synced in their shared mission. Outside, the first Zorvith forces began descending, their war machines landing in waves, the ground trembling under the weight of their advance. Voss stood atop a crumbling building, watching as the Zorvith forces began their descent. His pulse quickened, but his focus never wavered. This is it. Hayes's voice crackled through his communicator, a fierce determination cutting through the static. They're almost in range. Are you ready? Voss's hand tightened around the wrist of his weapon. Ready. The first volley of missiles streaked through the air, a blur of fire and destruction. But it wasn't the Zorvith who had fired them. Human-made drones, sleek and silent, tore through the sky, striking at the heart of the Zorvith's landing fleet. The Resistance had launched their assault. The Zorvith forces staggered, confusion rippling through their ranks. They had expected a colony on the verge of collapse, an easy target for their overwhelming might. Instead, they were met with precision, with a resolve that even they couldn't ignore. Voss grinned, the adrenaline surging through him. They've made a mistake, he muttered to himself, his eyes never leaving the battlefield. They've underestimated us. As explosions lit the sky and human forces engaged in hit-and-run tactics, Voss felt a surge of hope, a hope that for the first time, humanity wasn't just fighting to survive. They were fighting to prove that they would never be slaves to anyone. The battle was far from over, but humanity had sent its message loud and clear. The Zorvith might be powerful, but they were not prepared for the wrath of humanity's determination. The galaxy would soon learn, humans did not fear war. They were war. The shadows of the Galactic Council chamber stretched long, mirroring the weight of the decision that hung over them. On one side of the vast, crystalline table sat Voss, still grim from his victory on New Terra. He had fought for humanity's survival, but now, standing before the self-assured council, he knew the hardest battle was yet to come. High Chancellor Drexel's eyes, glowing like embers, scanned Voss with disdain. You are bold, Captain, I'll give you that. But let us not forget, it was a fluke. His voice was thick with a condescending edge. Voss stood unmoved, his hands clasped behind his back. Fluke or not, the Zorvith have learned something valuable today. He leaned forward, locking eyes with the Chancellor. They've learned that humans will fight back. You should be worried, not dismissive. The members of the council murmured among themselves. Drexel, however, remained stoic, unflinching. Humanity has no place in this conflict. We have given you the chance to prove your worth, and yet, you squander it. His gaze turned cold. The Zorvith will recover, as they always do. They will come back stronger. This will be your undoing. Voss's pulse quickened, but he maintained his composure. He knew the council had underestimated humanity before, and this moment was no different. The Zorvith made a fatal mistake when they believed we would fall in line. You, too, will regret underestimating us. Drexel's lips curled into a thin smile. Let us see. On New Terra, the battlefield was far from over. The Zorvith, their pride wounded, regrouped under the command of the towering warlord Vrokith, a ruthless tactician with a singular goal, to eradicate humanity once and for all. Their first strike had been a failure, but this time, they would show no mercy. Voss stood at the edge of the war-torn city once again, his eyes scanning the horizon. The battle had begun in earnest now, and he could feel the weight of every decision pressing against him. The Zorvith had made their move, sending waves of warships to bomb the remaining human strongholds. It was an all-out invasion. Captain, the fleet is almost within range, Hayes said, stepping up beside him. Her face was streaked with sweat, but her voice was firm. We need to make our move before it's too late. Voss turned to her, his expression resolute. They think we're unprepared, but we're not. We've been waiting for this moment. It's time to show them what humanity can really do. Back in the council chamber, Drexel's expression remained unchanged as he stared at the hollow screen in front of him, displaying real-time footage of New Terra's destruction. The Zorvith warships, massive and unrelenting, tore into the planet's defenses, sending shockwaves of fear through the remaining humans. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, humanity wasn't surrendering. A sudden burst of data interrupted Drexel's thoughts, and he narrowed his eyes as a new image appeared: human ships, small and agile, striking at the Zorvith's weakest points with precision. The Council's collective attention snapped to the screen. "This can't be," murmured Admiral Relker, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How are they?" "They must be using guerrilla tactics," Vrax, the diplomat of the Dominion, interrupted, his voice heavy with apprehension. "It's the only logical explanation." Drexel's voice, once filled with arrogance, now faltered. "We've underestimated them." He turned toward Voss's image on the hollow screen. "The humans have adapted quickly, this is no longer a skirmish." On the surface of New Terra, Voss and his team moved with purpose, coordinating human forces as they clashed with the Zorvith in the ruins of their once proud cities. The planet had become a battleground, but humanity was not cowering. They fought with an intensity, a grit, that no one had anticipated. The Zorvith were used to overwhelming force, but the humans fought like cornered animals, ferocious and unpredictable. Now, Voss ordered through his comms, and the ground beneath them trembled as the first wave of human warships emerged from their hidden hangars. The Zorvith had been expecting a weak counterattack, a desperate plea for mercy. Instead, they were greeted with the full force of humanity's military might, ships that could move faster, think smarter, and hit harder than anything the Zorvith had ever encountered. The Zorvith were quick to respond, but their strategy was flawed. They did not know the full extent of humanity's capabilities. As human ships darted in and out of their formation, striking with surgical precision, the Zorvith commanders struggled to adapt. On the ground, the resistance forces, soldiers, engineers, and civilians alike, fought with unwavering determination. Hayes led the charge, her voice a rallying cry as she directed troops to key locations, ambushing the enemy with guerrilla tactics that confounded the Zorvith's forces. Voss watched the battle unfold through a series of live feeds, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Humanity was sending a message. They weren't just going to survive, they were going to win. Back in the council chamber, Drexel's face had gone ashen. The humans were succeeding. Despite all their efforts, humanity was proving to be a force to be reckoned with. The council's complacency was coming back to haunt them. "We were wrong," Drexel finally admitted, his voice thick with regret. "The humans have far more resilience than we ever imagined." Admiral Relker nodded grimly. "And now, they will never stop. Not until we acknowledge them." Drexel turned sharply to the assembly, his voice filled with urgency. "Prepare for the worst. The humans are not a threat we can ignore. They will change the galaxy, whether we like it or not." The battle for New Terra raged on, but Voss knew one thing was certain: humanity was no longer just a player in the galaxy. They were the force that no one could afford to overlook. And for the first time in history, the Galactic Council was beginning to realize they had made a grave mistake. The sky above New Terra was an unforgiving shade of red as the final assault began. For the past 3 days, the Zorvith had launched wave after wave of relentless bombardments. Yet, despite the odds, humanity's resolve had only strengthened. What was once a war for survival had transformed into a war of will, and the will of humanity was unyielding. Captain Elias Voss stood atop a crumbling tower, his eyes scanning the horizon where smoke billowed and the remnants of buildings lay in ruin. The Zorvith fleet had come in full force, far more ships than anyone could have anticipated, but they were not prepared for what humanity had devised. "We're ready, Captain," General Hayes' voice crackled through his comm. "The first wave is positioned, and our drones are in place. The Zorvith won't know what hit them." Voss exhaled slowly, the weight of their strategy heavy on his shoulders. "Let's make sure they never forget what happens when they underestimate humans." He looked out at the battlefield, the ground below trembling under the Zorvith's assault. The battle was at its peak. Human forces were barely holding their ground, but it was all part of the plan. The Zorvith had come thinking humanity was already broken, but in truth, they were walking into a trap. In the depths of the Zorvith flagship, Warlord Vrokith watched with growing frustration as the battle raged on. His ships had delivered devastating blows, yet humanity had refused to fold. This was not the enemy he had expected. They were fighting back with tactics Vrokith couldn't even comprehend. They are resilient, his lieutenant observed, the reptilian warrior's voice thick with contempt. But they are weak. This will end today. Vrokith growled, his sharp teeth glistening. We'll see how resilient they are when we turn the planet into ash. Destroy them. Leave no survivors. On the ground, Voss's team moved quickly, coordinating each strike with precision. Humanity's advantage wasn't just in its technology or its ability to build advanced weaponry, it was in strategy. As the Zorvith charged forward, humanity's forces blended seamlessly with the ruined landscape, using stealth, speed, and misdirection to throw the enemy into disarray. General Hayes led a group of soldiers in a daring ambush, hiding behind the wreckage of a once great city hall. As a Zorvith war machine trundled past, she signaled her troops. Now! The silence of the moment was broken by a deafening barrage. Explosions ripped through the Zorvith ranks, sending debris and smoke into the air. They staggered, confused, as human forces emerged from their hidden positions, striking with lethal precision. For the first time in days, the Zorvith faltered. This is it, Hayes muttered to herself, watching the chaos unfold. The tide is turning. Back in the council chamber, the transmission from New Terra blared through the speakers, catching every delegate's attention. The live feed showed the battlefield, with the Zorvith clearly losing ground. The humans were not just holding their own, they were winning. Admiral Relker's eyes widened as he watched human ships dance around Zorvith cruisers, dodging fire and striking their targets with pinpoint accuracy. How are they doing this? He whispered, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and admiration. The room was thick with tension. High Chancellor Drexel's face was pale as he stared at the screen. The arrogance that had once defined him was quickly replaced with a growing sense of dread. No. This is impossible. They are not just fighting, they are winning. Their tactics are evolving, Relker observed, his voice trembling with realization. They're learning faster than we can predict. If they continue this, they could wipe the Zorvith from New Terra entirely. Drexel clenched his fists. We can't allow this to happen. They've already shown too much strength. If we let them defeat the Zorvith, they'll become unstoppable. Back on the front lines, Voss and Hayes fought side by side as the final push began. The Zorvith, their morale shattered by the unexpected ferocity of humanity's defense, began to retreat. The human forces, emboldened by victory, pressed forward, determined to ensure the Zorvith would never return. Keep pushing! Voss shouted, rallying his troops. This isn't over until the last Zorvith ship is out of our skies. The human soldiers surged forward, their energy renewed by the realization that they had not just held their ground, they had taken control. For the first time, the Zorvith warships were on the defensive, retreating into the void of space as humanity's warships closed in. On the Zorvith flagship, Vrokith's fury reached a boiling point. His forces were in disarray, his ships retreating under the relentless human assault. You cannot run forever, he roared, slamming his fist into the control panel in front of him. We will finish this, one way or another. But Voss's voice echoed through the comm system before he could finish. You've lost, Vrokith. Surrender, and we might just let you live. The transmission cut out, but Vrokith's rage boiled over. He had never been forced into retreat. To lose to humans, the very species he had once believed incapable of victory, was a humiliation he would not soon forget. As the battle neared its end, Voss and Hayes stood amidst the ruins of New Terra. The sky, once stained with the fires of war, was beginning to clear. The sounds of distant gunfire faded as the Zorvith retreated, their fleet broken, their forces scattered. The victory was humanity's. Mission accomplished, Captain, Hayes said, her voice filled with both relief and quiet pride. Voss nodded, but his eyes were focused on the horizon. This isn't just a victory for New Terra. This is a message to the galaxy. Humanity is not just a survivor. We're a force to be reckoned with. He turned to face her, a steely determination in his gaze. And now, the galaxy will know, humans do not fear war. We will win.